Great to see you, man.
Good to see you.
Can you talk about growing up in New Hampshire and like your earliest recollection of when you started listening to music? Was it a real young age or
Y-
teenager or?
Yeah. I mean, that's the right place to start. I had two things working to my advantage. One of them was my mother had a good record collection. She was true to her time. She was the daughter of a West Point uh, Army colonel and a child of the 60s.
Wow.
Uh, so she went in two directions, but if you have a father like that, you got to push away. And I think music was one way she did it. So she had Stones, she had Beatles, she had Dylan, she had Aretha Franklin, she had Pete Seeger, Josh White, Ian and Sylvia, Simon
Wow.
and Garfunkel. So there was a folk part. Uh, there was, a 60s rock part. And then, she left my father when I was about two. We moved to Concord, New Hampshire. And my uncle was living upstairs, and he listened to what was already being called oldies radio. And that meant we were getting Chuck Berry, Little
Oh,
Richard,
yeah.
Buddy Holly from upstairs. So the pretty good setup.
Yeah, I'd say.
And then I'm the youngest, so there's also that filtering effect of things coming down, particularly from my older brother. So he's 4 years older. And that meant so we were situated to know where, you know, Bruce Springsteen, television, Tom Petty, the gun, not the gun club, you know, it's like we're coming into even like a Bob Seger.
Yeah.
Uh, I'm mixing up my time periods now, but we with the background that we had, we knew bands that had an interest in some of those roots. Like even if it wasn't intellectually, intuitively, you knew that these artists who were coming along in the later part of the 70s knew Little Richard, knew Chuck
Yeah.
Berry, understood Dylan in context, and they were ours. They didn't belong to our uncle, they didn't belong to my mother, they were ours. And so a great informal education.
Do you remember what bands or artists you grasped onto early on and you like, this is what I really like? Were there any in particular that you like really started listening to? Or was it all of them?
We didn't differentiate. I was talking with somebody about television, and I wouldn't put television high on that list, but we got the Adventure album, and it
Oh
was
yeah.
also the album era. So when you got something, and this was at Pitchfork Records on Main Street in Concord, which is still there. Like my mother died this past year, and at the memorial, the guy who owned Pitchfork Records spoke. You know,
Wow.
that's that's how much that record store meant to us. But if you went and bought a television record, we didn't have Marquee Moon, but we got Adventure and we listened to the whole thing. We didn't look for a song. I mean, we really
Yeah.
took it in because albums were, if you bought one, it was kind of a significant transaction. Um,
You must have ended up going back to Marquee Moon though after you heard Adventure, right?
a little bit, but I think it was a bit like Big Star in that by
Hmm.
the 80s, um, they were so hyped in our little underground community that you almost had a reaction that was not particularly intelligent, but it was like so many people were talking about Big Star, you were like, oh my God.
Yeah.
Then later I went back to Big Star. Sorry, my cat is going to walk into the scene
Yeah.
here.
I have one of
Then,
those
then
too,
you,
and
then
he's
you go
already,
back and you listen to Marquee Moon and you
yeah.
listen to the Big Star records and go, oh, yeah, everybody was right. And I was just being a little bit of
What
a meathead about it.
what about playing? When did you start playing? And was it the guitar right on or?
No, 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 no. So my mother, so I already talked about the kind of dichotomy that informed her, child of the 60s, daughter of a
Military.
West Point
Yeah.
guy. She wanted us to learn instruments, and
Oh,
she was pretty West Point about it. But it wasn't traditional. It wasn't like you're going to learn violin. So I was in elementary school, early elementary, playing the four-string banjo, which is basically a ukulele with a banjo body. And, I had this teacher, Mrs. Paul, who was from the South and still had a Southern accent. And, it was Camp Town races and Skip to My Lou. And, I hated every minute of it. And nonetheless, it got some of that basic, popular folk catalog into my system.
yeah.
But it didn't stick, and then my brother had to play guitar, and I remember he took to it and he resisted it. There's something about that top-down parental thing. Even when it's cool, you want to resist it.
Yeah. I
And
was
then
the oldest, I remember.
yeah, yeah, but my brother Dan came back to it where I went to sports.
Oh,
And
really?
yeah, we didn't have a lot of money, um, but we had cultural capital, not economic capital. But also a certain craftiness. Like I wanted to ski race, and it's expensive, but I figured out a way to do it. I wouldn't call them entrepreneurial skills. I would call them manipulation skills. But I found a way to
That's
get the
good.
money. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then I started bicycle racing, and it got pretty serious. So uh, that's a whole nother longer story. But with bicycle racing, it got to the point where I was sponsored by. I went away to boarding school, and one of my friends was the Brian Henson, Jim Henson of the Muppets' son.
Oh, that's cool.
And he went to his dad knowing I didn't have the resources to race through the summer, but he knew that I was very serious about it, and I had some ability. And his dad sponsored me for 2 seasons. Jim Henson stepped in and
Wow.
made it possible for me. So I kind of like, and this is to the Boston part of the story. Our mother had said, like, if you can get scholarships, you can go away to a better school. And so I went to Phillips Andover, where my brother had gone. And, at the time, it was like the number one
Phillips
ranked.
Academy, right? Yeah.
Yeah. It was a really great
Yeah.
school where I was at the bottom of my class. And I was, so I was at boarding school, I was bicycle racing, and I was also sneaking into Boston at night. So I had a black ski mask. I had this full black outfit because there was
Yeah.
campus security. And I would leave my dorm and meet with, mostly it was Steve Morrell, who was the first Del Fuegos drummer.
Still
Uh,
around town, Boston playing. I saw him not too long
yeah,
ago, actually.
yeah. And we would drive into uh, Boston and go see Boston bands. And then, the sun would be coming up and it'd be dropping me off at prep school. And uh, as I got to my senior year, I did enough of that I kind of like made a little bit of a space for myself in that scene. Yes, it was as Dan's little brother. I was crazy and I looked like I was 12 and I could probably drink more than people who looked like they were 40. Uh, and
Well, you were pretty young when you started, so I
yeah, yeah.
mean,
So I was 17 when
yeah.
Dan had they were playing shows with the Blasters, and Dan got it in his head like, wow, the Del Fuego should be a brother band. And he called me, and I had 3 months to learn how to play guitar before my first gig. at the In Square Men's Bar. And the
Wow.
second or third gig was CBGB's playing for Slash Records. And they saw that show and they said no to the band and came back 6 months later. But that's a Boston story about how all that went down. So going back to your original instrument question, what was I playing? I was playing drums out in the barn. You know, we lived on a small kind of farm. When we moved out to the country when I was in fourth grade, there's a drum kit out there. I play along with particularly a WRKO 2 album set that had like Hanky Panky on it. You know, it was all the hits of the
Yeah.
day. You know, Sam the Sham and the Pharaohs. Played drums to that and played drums to the Who's Next, and no teachers involved. It was more like I was getting something out of my system. So I had to learn guitar. But it was, we were essentially a punk rock and roll band. And so the bar wasn't particularly low to get under, if limbo is my metaphor.
When did you actually move into Boston?
Day I
For,
graduated, that was my mother's deal, because uh, Dan went to me like, "Do you want to join the band?" I said, "Yes." "What instrument do I play?" He said, "You're going to play guitar," and then it was obvious like he should swing past my mother, and she was kind of bummed because it was like, "Oh, well, no college for this guy." And um, as it happened, I hadn't filled out any applications anyway, so she was out of luck either way. Um, but we got sign off, but she said he's got to finish. And so the day I graduated, Tom and Steve and Dan came to graduation, have some photos of it, and then we rehearsed that night.
wow. Where did you live in Boston when you finally moved down there?
I, I lived in Alston. It's just
Of course.
we just did some gigs at City Winery in Boston
I
over the
heard.
holiday. And I was telling this story about when I joined. Like Dan and Steve said, "We'll share an apartment with you. Like we're not going to take you still a kid and leave you to your own devices. We're going to get an apartment with you." So the three of us got an apartment together. The first night after that rehearsal, we go back, we're all there. That was the last night either of them ever stayed there. They were always at their girlfriends.
You had your
So
own place.
I
That's
was
good.
totally, and there was no clock there. So I would open, and it was one of these kind of what we call garden level apartments. So, when I opened the window, my head was where people's feet were walking by. And since we didn't have a clock, I'd open it up and say to people, "Excuse me, do you know what time it is?"
You know,
That's the kind of primitive living that I was in.
you mentioned the In Square Men's Bar, which I was actually there yesterday, but it's the S&S Deli now. But uh, did the band already have a vision at that point? I mean, what were you guys
Yes.
thinking? What was the
Yes.
vision and from for back
The
then for you guys?
Well, the vision, it wasn't the Del Fuegos coming up with that vision. They were collaborators, but the principal visionary in this case was Lily Dennison.
Lily.
And yeah, Lily was waitressing at the Rat, but she had already started managing bands locally, and she was really a bit of a taste maker, introducing the band to particularly like some West Coast acts and the Slash family.
Hmm.
So part of what they started doing before I was in the band was Lily booking any opening spot she could get with any Slash band.
Wow.
Or, if you could get a spot with the Cramps, great. But, Blasters, Gun Club, one of my early gigs was opening for Rank and File. So she just thought like if there was any dream label for this band, it was Slash out
Wow,
of
that is
LA.
that is visionary for sure.
Yeah. So my third or second, and I don't know what the chronology is there, that CBGB's gig, we were playing for Bob Biggs. And the bad decision was having me join the band right at that point. Because it's like they were breaking in a wild pony while someone from a label was coming to see. And it's like, it's not a pretty thing when you're breaking in a horse. And he was like, they don't, no. Everybody thought this was going to be a victory lap. I remember the drive back to Boston, and in my mind, I was thinking, these guys are being really nice to me because if I were in their shoes, having done the build that they did to play for Bob Biggs at Slash, um, I'd be pissed at me for like, because what was
Hmm.
different? I was the different thing. And he said no. And so that's, I alluded to there's a Boston story in this. And, I think it's fairly well known among those who want to know about the minutia of these things. But then, you know, the equivalent of Slash in Boston was Ace of Hearts, Rick Hart's label.
Yes.
So when I started playing shows, it was I would almost describe it as a post Mission of Burma, post neighborhoods. It was the prettiest girl moment had passed. The neighborhoods were still playing, but their kind of apex had passed. I still thought great band, um, but I think it's tough on a band to go through personnel changes. And John Hartcorn left the
Right.
neighborhood, and then there were a series of changes. I think those things are hard to weather. David's like a powerful presence, I think, and always would be. Super charismatic, great player, great record maker and writer. Um, but it was, just giving you context. It was past their moment.
You,
Burma,
if I can interject for 1 second, because you probably
yeah,
don't know this, but I actually signed the neighborhoods to Enigma when they were kind of like had gone through that whole period, because that was
yeah,
around 80, late 84, 85. So I
yeah,
know exactly what you're talking about. They had that huge buzz and then they went down a little, but we brought
yeah.
him back up a little ways.
Yeah, a band that more people should know about. But it was a regional time. They
Yeah.
were a great example. A better example is actually the Michael Stanley band out in the Cleveland area. They were playing arena-like spaces in Cleveland, and nobody knew who they were in Mississippi. Nobody knew who they were in Boston. Um, so you could be fully developed, and the neighborhoods were huge. And Prettiest Girl is a song I still will listen to. A year hasn't passed when I'm not in my car at some point going, I gotta hear Prettiest Girl. It had so much to it. But anyway, also post Mission of Burma, because Roger Miller had those hearing issues. But I listened like a teenager and I still do. So I'm listening to Prettiest Girl. I'm listening to Academy Fight Song like they're being played on WRKO,
It was an
like
incredible era, that early 80. You're talking 80,
totally.
80 to 84. That whole period was
Yeah.
fantastic.
But there was one band that was like above all for me because
Hmm.
they were still current. It wasn't post, and that was the Liars.
Oh,
And
yeah.
when I was still at boarding school, like I'd go into Boston, the Del Fuegos would be playing with the Liars, and I still think it might have been one of the best examples of live rock and roll being played that I would ever see. And Mono Man, uh, a complicated band leader for many musicians, but that guy was on to something.
Oh,
And
yeah.
maybe technically not the greatest voice, but a totally rock and roll voice. He had a way of picking songs, he had a way of writing songs, and visually, when he got going with the tambourine and the
Yeah.
organ and he's singing, and he's covered in sweat. It was like, that's like as good as it gets. And I Want to Help You, Ann is another record. Don't Give It Up Now. I don't stop listening to that stuff because there's something in it. I've grown enough that I can look at them and go, these aren't perfect recordings, but I also go, I wouldn't change a thing.
I saw the Liars once at the CMJ convention. It was in their 80s, and he had a bottle of vodka and it broke, and he cut the bridge of his nose. I don't mean to laugh when I say this, but he played the whole set with blood streaming down his face. The
It's
audience was like, "What?" And he didn't even wasn't even fazed by it. It
Yeah,
was
well,
incredible.
there's something also almost it's almost like he would go under some kind of spell, something
Yeah.
almost shamanic about that guy. So back to the narrative, Ace of Hearts, neighborhoods were there, Burma was there, Liars were there. Around our time, the Neats were there. It was like classic ruins. There was no place else to be. And even though I was the young kid, I still, when we went to record a record for Ace of Hearts, I said, we got to do something with Mono Man from the Liars. And we did a version of Busy Man that someone released without anybody's permission in France, and you can still find it
Wow.
somewhere.
I gotta look
Um,
for
but
that.
yeah, like because it wasn't that the other guys didn't think he was anything less than great. They thought he was great, but I was the one who was like I was his biggest champion. Um, so Rick arranged it, and we did Busy Man in the studio. But Rick Hart was great. He obviously, if you look at that label, it's super interesting because he was really thinking with all the intelligence that Warner Brothers was at the time, in the early 70s. They were picking bands. It wasn't all James Taylor and Van Morrison. It was Alice Cooper. Uh, it was, there was even some, deeper funk, but it was Captain Beefheart. Uh, there were more unlike things, but there were really good choices in those areas. And Rick Hart was making really good choices. So it wasn't if we couldn't get to Slash, Ace of Hearts felt right. So we went into the studio, we made a record, and then Slash Records said, actually, we want the Del Fuegos. And they had to buy us out uh, from Ace of Hearts.
So
And
was there a
so
full? I knew about I'll always call her back. Was there a full
I
unreleased?
always call her back wasn't Rick Hart.
Oh,
That
Rick
that
didn't do that.
No, Nat Freeberg
Oh,
paid
wow.
for that recording. Yeah, so this was Nat. God, I hate that I'm forgetting the bands, but it was the Fly. He was in the Flies,
And then the
pre-Titanic.
Titanics, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, um, and to Nat's credit, he just like identified there being something to this band. And the funny thing about that record, so it was recorded before my time. That was a three-piece. That was Tom Lloyd, Steve Morell,
Oh, so you
Dan
don't
Zane.
play on that track?
Uh-uh. Nope.
Okay, I didn't
Nope.
realize that. That's the one that was
Yeah.
on the Rhino compilation, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. In my view, and I can say it with a measure of objectivity, a great record.
Yeah, yeah.
And
I
that
love it.
record, Robert Plant heard that record. He passed through Boston. Somebody at a record store. He was like, "What do you think I should get?" And they're like, "Get this." He went and talked about it in a Rolling Stone interview.
Wow.
Yeah, Sam Phillips somehow got a copy of that, or someone played it for him. He talked about it. So there was some. I mean, it was a good record. It had a thing. It had an aesthetic. I think some combination, the way Tom was playing bass to Steve's drumming, and the way Dan was writing and that kind of almost surfish guitar lines that were decidedly rock and roll. Uh, there was a Dwayne Eddy-ish uh, kind of thing, but it was totally garage.
I love
But
that
some
track, man.
was making real sense, but that period of the Del Fuego sound was kind of over with that. The Slash record was different, you
Yeah,
know.
you guys went in a more less raucous but a more commercial direction is what I would think. You know what I
Yeah.
wanted to go ahead, sorry.
No, no, I was gonna say, and some there's a melancholy to the story because on a lot of levels, that's the end of the Boston chapter.
Hmm.
Once we sign with Slash, and I think from some, maybe the biggest piece of melancholy, and we've talked about it, was we signed with Slash. That means leaving Rick Hart, and then at a certain point.